Welcome to part 2 of the flipped classroom for chapters 38 and 39, going over from the years from 1945 to 1975. In this section, we're going to stick to decolonization. Many colonial independence movements in newly independent countries actually manipulated Cold War politics and allied themselves either with the United States or the USSR in exchange for access to military aid, money, trading, and technology. And the United States and the USSR in turn manipulated these governments for their own Cold War purposes. So that is the part of the relationship between independence and the Cold War. Independence was really far from rosy for many of the new countries in the post war eras. And peoples from Asia, Latin America, and African countries suffered from corrupt governments, dependent economies, and insurgent movements after their independence was gained. There is a pattern of decolonization that you need to understand, and you also need to understand the results. There are specific examples that are very important. These examples are within your packet, period 6 packet, and I listed some of them here. So in general, one of the biggest colonizational or decolonizational patterns is the settler versus non-settler colonies. Settler colonies, or those colonies in which many people from the mother country settled permanently, are listed here. And non-settled colonies are up above. Non-settler colonies tended to achieve independence relatively peacefully, as with the examples of Indonesia, Singapore, and Ghana. Although there was a lot of movement between colonies here, there was really no movement of Europeans, large groups of Europeans to these colonies. While settler colonies had really protracted independence struggles with a lot of violence against their overlords. Some examples of this are Kenya and South Africa, and also Algeria. Algeria is a French colony, whereas Kenya and South Africa were British. Latin American countries can be included here, and they struggle to throw off the economic yoke of the United States and their own corrupt governments. Sometimes these countries even turn to communism, as in the case of Venezuela. So here we can see a map of different colonial empires, and it's very difficult to see when they gained independence, but India is 1947, and then Pakistan with Bangladesh, which was also part of Pakistan at the time, that was also 47. Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, in the 60s, Laos in the 60s as well, or actually in the 50s, but then later on, when people get uninvolved, is much later on, et cetera, et cetera. And you can read these dates in the books. And then decolonization of Africa, many countries were decolonized in the 60s. So 1960, as you can see here in the north for the French, and also in the 70s. Some places hung on much longer. Nambia in the 90s, Angola 1973. Let's see, Mozambique 1975. So these areas became independent months later. You'll notice Egypt 1922. This is going back to the Ottomans, and there's definitely some variation. So this picture is from independence, and this guy in the picture, Kwame Nkrumah, is actually celebrating, he's actually from Ghana, although he's celebrating the independence of Kenya. He became the president in 1957, and he was a founding member of the Organization for African Unity, and he advocated Pan-Africanism. So there's his name down there. You do need to know that, and you need to know Pan-Africanism, or Organization of African Unity. So Kenya had a long, protracted struggle for independence, with Jomo Kenyatta being the first president there. A lot of times the independence depended also on resources. For example, going back, if you look at Nigeria, they had a large amount of oil, and so even though there wasn't a lot of settlement there, it was difficult for the British to pull out of Nigeria. There was also a lot of protest against colonization in Vietnam, and originally this was against the French, and the Vietnamese protested the French occupation, as is here. This is seen here. But when the French left, they put into place a dictator who was pro-France, and this led to a lot of protests. One example of this that really caught the world surprise is what's going on here. And this is Tai Quang Duc, a monk who self-immolated himself by setting himself on fire with gasoline in a busy street in Siam, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, in 1963. And the reason that he did this was to protest the treatment of the Buddhists by the Roman Catholic president. They were being treated unfairly, subjugated, and after this, the president promised to reform, but never did. And this led to even more protests and the Vietnam War. So this guy, and the president was Diem. So this guy was an example of protest against the colonial empires. There were also demonstrations against the Balfour Declaration and the creation of Israel because of the movement of Palestinians, and we'll be getting more into the creation of Israel both with the presentations and in class. And you can see the original, after the Balfour Declaration, the original section of land that Israel controlled is much smaller than the section of land that they ended up controlling. It's the very light green here. They ended up controlling all of this because of different wars that they won in the 60s and 70s. They actually, for a time, controlled the Sinai Peninsula, but they gave that up in 1982 and returned it to Egypt. So now Palestine is technically these two sections, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And again, we'll be talking more about that in class. Okay, finally moving into China. In China, Mao Zedong conquered the Kuomintang, and he instituted new government, society, and economy. Part of this was his Cultural Revolution, and part of this was the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was the economic side, where China, through a process of collectivization and farming, was supposed to become a great world power. However, it was a huge failure, and the groups will talk about that in class. The Cultural Revolution was about stamping out ancient philosophies and replacing it with Maoism. It was effective, but not entirely so. It kind of created a cult of Mao. And as time went on and China became a stronger nation, even though they were communists, their relationship with the USSR was strained. And this had to do with money, who was getting what aid. It also had to do with the relationship between China and the United States. And as they became closer, the USSR did not like that. Japan, after they were defeated by the United States, formed a new government under US watch. It was in a parliamentary style and it was much more democratic. They rebuilt their economy with the help of close ties with the United States, and they restructured the Zaibatsu. In this picture, you can see Chairman Mao and the type of cult he created with his Cultural Revolution. And this shows the number of men and women by age in China. And if you notice this huge gap here, this is because of all of the people who died in the Great Leap Forward. It caused huge famine, massive amounts of death, um, and it was truly a horrific time in China. Check it out on your timeline, see when it's at, and read about it in your book. That's it for this part of the presentation. Have a good day.